Each of you will receive a pencil box, but guess what? Inside is not pencils. We're using it as a container to store paints, and we're going to double this up as a container for gouache, but also we're going to be putting oil paints there when we want to save our oils. Inside your box, you're going to find essentially a palette, which means that there's pigment that's poured onto those white sponges. You might need to hydrate your pigment. So I'm spraying mine with this mist sprayer. You can do the same because it will re-wet and you can rehydrate it and use it over and over again. This is going to be your palette, not just for gouache, but we're going to use this for oil painting too. This is exactly what I use at home. What this is a sheet of plexiglass. And this is brand new plexiglass, so you get to be the first one to peel the sticker off. Now there are stickers on the front, but there's also one on the back side. Personally, I like to leave one sticker on, and the reason why is because it creates a neutral background for me to mix my colors on. So I like to leave that one. Plus, I always have the option if my top front one gets ruined, I can flip it over to the back and use that if I wanted to save the plexiglass. I know that the other day you had some questions regarding where do you put your palette if there's no like table or stand for you to put it on. I'm going to show you what I do because we'll be using this kind of palette both for gouache and for oil. So I put it on my tray. And I know that seems precarious, but I paint like this all the time, including outdoors. This is how I paint. So I put my plexiglass right underneath that knob. It doesn't hurt the knob as far as I know, and I've been painting like that for years. If you don't want to put it there, you don't have to. You could put it on a stool, and I do actually have carts available if you guys would prefer a cart. But you might want to try it like this because it does a couple of things. It puts the palette right in front of you. It also forces you to stand a little bit farther back. Now, something else that I do, and this is something that a lot of artists do, but you don't necessarily have to, is I use a palette knife. So I do encourage you to use a palette knife for laying out a palette on the plexiglass. So you're going into your pencil box and you're not grabbing all the paint. You're just grabbing maybe a third or a quarter of each pigment and you're putting that on your palette to start off with. And I do like to mix with a palette knife. I'm going to show you that when we get to oils as well. So I like that because it keeps the colors saturated and they don't get muddy or murky. When it comes to oil painting, I prefer to do that because my brush will also get muddy if I'm using it to mix. And you guys have a limited amount of brushes. When we get our oil painting brushes, you're going to have a limit to 4. So typically when I paint, I use more than that when I oil paint. For this, we're using a water medium, obviously, and you're going to be using only 2 brushes. It is easier to clean while you're working those brushes because you just go over to the sink and rinse them off. So anyway, I'm mixing on the palette. You don't need to use a palette knife to mix on that palette, but you could if you wanted to, and that's why you have your very own palette knife. And yes, that's for you to hang on to for the remainder of the year if you so choose. If you don't want it, that's okay. I'll take it back. I love these knives. Warning, they do make kind of a scratchy, squeaky noise when you mix them on this surface. I have to say they make more of a noise with the gouache versus oil. I think because the oil has more of kind of like, well, lubrication with the linseed oil or the walnut oil. It just makes it easier and less squeaky. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a limited palette. So I have white, yellow, that reddish pink, a blue, and a green. That's it. And from those 5 hues, I'm going to make everything else. So I'm pre-mixing some colors there, but then I'm going to adjust it, and then I'll switch to mixing with my brush too. But I do like the idea of you guys grabbing from the pencil box, grabbing paint from there using the palette knife as opposed to a brush, because otherwise you're going to get your pencil box sponges all messy in there, and it would be good to keep them organized and neat. So you are going to be mixing a range of colors, and you can choose whatever colors you want. I was like picturing kind of a sunset-y colors, and I was kind of keeping the same kind of color scheme, sort of an analogous palette. So once you have your colors mixed, you can see I just popped the knife right below my plexiglass, making sure that it's not going to fall over. And then you're going to go to your name. Okay, hopefully you have this penciled out. If not, you're going to pencil out your name. I just went over it with Sharpie. Don't worry, because you might have to go over it another time after you apply gouache. So my thinking is that we use a name tag as a place to experiment with gouache, because I'm going to make the assumption that not everyone has used gouache before. And for this, I just want you to play with a couple of different methods. One is kind of that wet watercolor approach where you can thin it out with water. The other is with more of a thicker application. And you also should try doing a dry brush technique where you don't have hardly any water. You will need a paper towel for this. You might need more than one. I like to use white paper towels because they're more absorbent. So I have a couple rules that I will allow you to use. I'm also going to recommend that you wear gloves. In fact, I'm going to insist on that. This should be something that we get used to. And if you have a larger hand size, I'm going to have to purchase some larger gloves. But I paint with gloves all the time, and it is going to feel weird at first. But I am going to have you wear gloves just to protect your hands. Just so that you're aware, this is professional grade paint. I know that doesn't seem like a big deal, but I think it's cool because there is a difference between student grade and professional grade. This isn't something that you get in elementary school. This is real. This is what the professionals are using. Try different mark making. Try going in different directions. Try doing dry brush. Try doing little dots and flicks. Kind of think of your brush as sort of like a wand and get some movement in there. So this is a place for you to play and experiment, and it doesn't matter if it looks bad or not. And if your name gets covered, oh well, we'll just go over it with Sharpie later. We are working on a type of watercolor paper for this. Ideally, you'd want to use something like illustration board. So you've got to tell me if you are interested in doing a few of these or if you want to continue with them. That way I can make a point of putting that on my supply list and purchasing some. So the real heavy duty stuff is so solid that you really don't need to tape it. The watercolor paper I have for you to use today, you'll probably need to tape down, so you need to tape down all four sides. You can try clipping it with one of my clips, but chances are you'll probably need to tape it. So we're going to start off with a basic outline. So of course, the goal for today is that you try and get one thumbnail done. And just as a reminder, a thumbnail is a painting study in this case. It could also be a drawing, but this is a thumbnail study for a painting. Although the thing about these studies is you can decide to make it into a finished piece, like a larger piece, or you can decide like, hey, this is not that interesting. I'm going to just stop with this now that I've gotten it out of my system. So here's how I begin a thumbnail. I start off with a whole bunch of tick marks, and those tick marks, that's what I call them, they indicate the height and width, and they're kind of like drawing with a broken line. You've probably done something similar before with Carter. So I'm just getting my basic composition laid out, and I want to think of asymmetry and how it's going to flow. And I realize that I want to crop this, that I don't like it as a tall rectangle, that I'd rather have it more of a square shape. So I'm just going to crop off the top. That's why I drew a horizontal line. So you do want to get some information, but this is a study, so it doesn't need to be highly detailed. And you can see I'm using just a Bic pen, like a regular pen. You can do this with pencil if you prefer. Either one is fine. It's going to be covered by the gouache paint anyway. If you did not bring a thumbnail reference, you can use the still life materials that I have set up. There's a whole bunch of objects. You're welcome to any of those. I'm starting off with the cast shadows first. And this is how I work when I paint a still life. I would work this way if I were working in oils too. I'm going directly to the shadows and trying to articulate those. I'm starting out relatively thin with the paint. It's probably like a medium amount of water to paint ratio. And I'm just trying to kind of establish the values. I like to go in to the darker values first, so I'm just pretty much focused on the ground plane. And these are three objects I'm looking at in real time, so I'm observing them and I'm trying to document them looking down. So the point of view is looking down on the objects. Next, I'm going into that ground plane. So what's the actual color or colors that I'm seeing in the ground plane? Technically, it's a gray ground plane, but as you know, nothing's ever just gray. There's other colors in there. There's temperature shifts, so I'm looking for that. And I know that if I make it a little bit darker on the bottom and lighter as it moves up the painting, then it's going to help the idea of depth. I do think it would be good for you guys to try mixing your own blacks. This one is a color I mixed and it's looking a little purpley, but I'm adding on to it as I go. So here we are a little bit later in the painting process. I didn't want to bore you and show you the whole thing. I'm using a little bit of dry brush. I'm using thin areas in some places so it looks a little bit like watercolor. And then there are other areas where it's a little bit thicker. I tend to wait till the end to put in my thicker values, but you don't necessarily have to. So just as a heads up, this will probably take an hour. This took me about an hour and a half to do. I feel like it shouldn't have taken that long, but it did. There are going to be some moments where you might feel frustrated with the medium. I certainly felt that at some point in the painting. I'm like, it's not working. But it's part of that's because I'm not familiar with gouache as much as I am with oil, and oil's like my go-to. Um, I have 20 years of painting oil and maybe like a month of painting gouache if I'm lucky. But I did take a gouache workshop, and just like with anything, the more you play with it, the better you're gonna get. I do think it looks really good, so I'm an admirer of gouache artists. I'm gonna call this piece done. Right now, this study is pretty loose, but that's okay. It's a study. It doesn't have to be anything tight. What I care about is evaluating the composition, how those values are relating to each other, the colors, the color harmony, and the sense of depth. That study helps me to determine whether or not I'm interested in pursuing this in a larger piece. As far as AP, this would be a good thing for you to get into the habit of doing, whether it's with gouache or with another medium, doing a little study of what you plan on doing for a final work.